The weight of being. Found her grandmother had pressed the words into her palm like a coin the morning before she died. A woman who knows her own worth never truly goes hungry. The world may starve her, but it cannot convince her she deserves to starve. Marin Ashby was 9 years old at the time, and she had not understood it. She understood it even less at 24, standing in the cold corridor outside her own apartment, with a ring on her finger and a heart cracking open like dry earth in a drought, listening to the sounds from inside that told her everything she needed to know. She pressed her back against the wall. The hallway smelled of old carpet and someone else's dinner. She did not cry, not yet. She simply looked down at the ring, a modest silver band with a chip of moonstone at its center, and for one terrible moment she wondered if her grandmother had been wrong. She kept the ring. That was the first stubborn thing she did. She would keep it long after it stopped meaning what it once meant, because it was the last thing her grandmother's hands had ever touched, passed down through a mother who had already left, arriving at Marin the way all inheritances eventually do, without a map. She did not know yet that the night had further plans for her. Chapter 1. What the Dark Takes. The apartment door opened. Marin did not wait to see faces. She turned and walked, then walked faster, and then she was running, because running at least felt like a decision. She lived in Dunmere, a border town wedged between human territory and the vast, fog-threaded wilderness claimed by the Veilwood pack, the most powerful pack on the continent, ruled by an alpha king whose name people said the way they said the names of storms. Calder Viel. Quietly, with respect, and with the understanding that you were speaking about something older and larger than yourself. Marin had no wolf. She'd been born into a pack-adjacent family, that uneasy category of people with shifter blood too diluted to manifest. Her father's pack had tolerated her. Her fiancé, Devlin, had told her for 3 years that it didn't matter. He'd told her a lot of things. She ran without direction, which was how she ended up at the edge of the Veilwood. The Veilwood at night was not a place for the unshifted. Everyone in Dunmere knew this with the casual certainty of knowing not to touch a hot stove. The trees were black-barked and enormous, older than the town by several centuries, and the forest floor was a kingdom of root and shadow, where even strong wolves moved carefully. Marin stood at the tree line with no coat, no plan, and the ruins of a 3-year relationship sitting in her chest like broken crockery. She stepped in anyway, because she was cold, and she could see a firefly flicker of light somewhere between the trunks that she told herself was a farmhouse, though some part of her knew it wasn't. Because she was 24, and had just discovered that the person she'd trusted most found her easy to deceive, and that particular wound does something to a person's sense of self-preservation. She made it perhaps a quarter mile before the ground gave way, an old rain washout, camouflaged by leaf litter. Her ankle twisted on the drop, her knee hit rock, and she slid into a ditch that smelled of cold clay and winter. She lay there for a moment looking up at a ceiling of interlocked branches through which no stars were visible. "Well," she said to no one, "this is also very bad." She tried to stand. Her ankle said no with extraordinary authority. She tried again, gripped a root, made it upright, and then the pain bloomed so bright she sat right back down. She sat in the dark and thought about her grandmother's words. She thought about Devlin's voice through the door. She thought about the ring on her finger, the small cold weight of it, and she felt the first tears come. Not dramatic tears, not the kind that ask for an audience, but the quiet, exhausted kind that simply overflow when there is no more room. She was still crying when the wolf found her. Chapter 2. The King in the Dark. She heard him before she saw him, not the wolf, but the shift. A sound like a sail filling with wind, a deep structural rearrangement of the dark between the trees, and then a man was crouching at the edge of the ditch. He was very large. He wore nothing but dark trousers, which was normal for shifters in transition, though the cold that didn't touch him at all was not normal. His eyes were the color of amber held to firelight. They caught the darkness and returned something golden. "You're bleeding." His voice was unhurried, the way the voices of people who are never ignored tend to be. I'm aware. She looked at her knee, which was indeed bleeding through her torn jeans in a way that was more embarrassing than serious. You're also in the Veilwood at midnight, alone, without a wolf. Very observant. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't pity, which was what she was braced for. It was closer to attention, like she had his full and genuine attention, and he wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He jumped into the ditch without ceremony, which was slightly alarming given how large he was in an enclosed space. He crouched in front of her, examined her ankle with hands that were warm, almost startlingly warm, a wolf's metabolic heat, and she hated that it felt good, that warmth. She was so cold she'd stopped feeling her fingers. I can carry you out. Not may I, not would you like. A statement offered neutrally, waiting to become a question if she needed it to. I don't know you. Calder Vile. She stared at him. He met her stare without any particular interest in her reaction, which struck her as the most authentic thing about it. Everyone in Dunmere knows that name, she said finally. Yes. You're a long way from your great hall or wherever. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe. I run the border most nights. Old habit. Are you going to tell me your name? Or should I call you the woman who argues while bleeding in a ditch? Marin Ashby. She hesitated. And yes. Yes, I'll accept the carry. Thank you. He lifted her the way you'd lift something that mattered, which was the second thing that surprised her. Chapter 3. The Healer's House. He carried her to a border station at the edge of the wood, not his great hall, but a stone cottage that his pack maintained for exactly these kinds of situations, staffed by a sharp-eyed healer named Brix, who smelled of rosemary, and seemed entirely unsurprised to see the Alpha King arrive at midnight with a muddy, tear-stained, human-adjacent woman in his arms. Ankle sprain, knee laceration, Calder said, setting Marin down on a low examination bench with the same careful economy of motion. Brix looked at Marin with the frank assessment of someone used to body damage. The injuries or the face? She was already gathering supplies. Both, Marin said, and was surprised to find she meant it as a small joke, and was more surprised when Calder made that almost smile again from the corner of the room. He did not leave. Marin noticed this. He stood against the far wall with his arms crossed, not hovering, not staring, simply present in the way that a load-bearing wall is present. The kind of thing you don't notice until you think about what would happen without it. Brix wrapped the ankle and closed the knee with 3 careful butterfly strips and a salve that smelled of pine and turned the sting to nothing. She gave Marin a mug of something hot that tasted of honey and herbs and sat back. Someone's been crying hard before the fall. It wasn't cruel. It was the observation of a healer who needed context. My fiancé. Marin turned the ring on her finger without thinking, an old, nervous gesture. Is, I don't know yet. I found him tonight with... She stopped. The words sat in her chest like a stone. Calder did not say I'm sorry, or offer any of the usual social solvent phrases. He said, How long did you trust him? It was such a different question that she looked up. 3 years. And now you're wondering what that says about you. Her throat tightened. Isn't that reasonable? It would be, if it were his faithlessness that compromised your judgment. It isn't. It's just his faithlessness. Brix gave Marin a dry look that said, Yes, he's always like this. Marin stared at Calder across the small stone room. No one had ever handed her that particular reframe so cleanly, without fanfare, without asking for credit. She looked down at the ring. Her grandmother's ring, not Devlin's. She'd worn it alongside his, and in the corridor she'd already pulled his from her finger and left it on the floor without quite deciding to. Her grandmother's she'd kept. There was a saying, she said, and she didn't know why she was telling this to a stranger, except that the honey tea was warm and the room felt sealed from the world. My grandmother's. A woman who knows her own worth never truly goes hungry. I've been thinking about it all night. about whether I lost something of myself somewhere along the way. Let myself get small. Calder was quiet for a moment. The saying doesn't say the world won't try to make her small, just that she can't be convinced she deserves it. She looked at him for a long beat. You've thought about something like that before. I've carried people who let themselves believe they deserve to be discarded. His voice held something old and personal that he didn't elaborate on. It's a different kind of wound. Chapter 4. The days that followed. She expected it to end there. A strange night, a kind stranger, a walk back to Dunmere in the morning on a borrowed wrap bandage and borrowed boots because her own shoe had been swallowed by the clay. A story with no sequel. Calder sent a car for her, sent it, not drove, with a note that gave her the border station's communication channel and said only, for anything needed. The Veilwood is not safe alone at night. It was signed with just his initial. She sent back a note thanking him and thinking that was that. He sent a response asking how the ankle healed. This was how it began. Over the following 2 weeks, a correspondence developed that neither of them seemed willing to name. Brief at first, a question, an answer, a small observation, and then longer, the messages acquiring a rhythm that felt less like courtesy and more like conversation. He asked what she did. She was a botanical illustrator, working on commission for a natural sciences press, and picking up whatever else she could, because illustration for print paid in prestige far more reliably than in actual money. He sent back a thoughtful inquiry about whether she'd ever illustrated anything from the Veilwood, because the border territories had endemic species that had never been properly documented. She had not, she said, but she would like to. He arranged it. Not extravagantly, no grand invitation, no spectacle. A formal permit, a daytime guide, a note from Bricks that said the station cottage could be used as a base if she wanted. She understood, reading between the lines, that the Alpha King was finding reasons to keep a channel open without either of them having to say why, and she chose not to examine this too carefully because she was still figuring out what she felt about Devlin. She'd gone back to the apartment that first morning while he was gone, packed 2 bags with the methodical calm of someone who has decided to be practical, and left his key on the counter. She was staying with her friend Ossel, who worked at Dunmere's bakery, and had a sofa that was surprisingly comfortable and strong opinions about what Devlin Craith could do with himself. He called, Ossel reported on day 5, 3 times. I told him you'd died in a wolf attack, and I was handling the estate. You told him what? He sounded very upset. I think it was genuine. Ossel slid a pastry across the counter. Then I told him I was joking, and that you were fine and moving on with your life. He's been calling since. Marin ate the pastry. I'm not ready to talk to him. You don't have to be. Ossel looked at her sideways. You're also getting very good handwriting in some of these messages you've been drafting at midnight. Whoever that is has very prompt responses for an important person. Marin said nothing, which Ossel correctly interpreted as everything. Chapter 5. The Veilwood in Day. She went to the forest 10 days after the fall, on a clear morning when the frost made the black-barked trees look as though they'd been sketched in silver. The guide met her at the station, a young pack member named Thessaly, who was 17 and trying very hard not to look impressed that she'd been asked personally by the Alpha King. The Veilwood in daylight was entirely different from the Veilwood in darkness. It was extraordinary. Light broke through the canopy at angles that turned the forest floor into stained glass, and the endemic species were everything the scientific catalogs vaguely gestured at without capturing. A variety of bioluminescent moss that pulsed faintly even in daytime. A climbing fern with silver undersides that the pack called viol leaf and considered protective. A mushroom ring so precise and enormous it looked deliberate. Marin drew for 5 hours without stopping. She sat on a fallen log and worked in her sketchbook with a focused joy she hadn't felt in months. The kind of absorption that reminds you who you are underneath everything that's been happening to you. Calder came at midday. He wasn't announced. Thessaly simply glanced toward the tree line, and then found something important to study in the opposite direction, with great professionalism. He crouched beside her log and looked at her sketchbook. She showed him without being asked. He looked at the drawings the way he seemed to look at everything, with full attention, without pretense. "The bioluminescence," he said. "You captured it in pencil. I didn't know that was possible. Everything can be captured if you're willing to look at it long enough." She heard her grandmother in that, a little, and smiled without meaning to. He looked at her instead of the drawing. Not for long, and not with any pressure in it. Just a moment where he looked, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could pinpoint, entirely visible. "The guide tells me you've been working without a break since 7 this morning." "I might have lost track of time." He sat down beside her on the log. The log was large enough for two, barely. He was warm even through his jacket, that shifter warmth, and the cold that had been making her ears ache stepped back from her like a polite stranger. "Devlin Craith called me," she said, because it was sitting in her chest and she was tired of carrying things alone. He didn't ask how Devlin had gotten the number, which suggested he'd already considered this. "He said I was making a mistake, that I was upset and acting dramatically, and that I should come home." She picked up her pencil and turned it in her fingers. "He said I was lucky he was patient with me." A silence. The forest made its quiet sounds around them. "What did you say?" "I hung up, but the thing is..." She pressed the pencil to the sketchbook, not drawing, just resting it there. For about 30 seconds after, I thought, is he right? Am I being dramatic? Would it be easier to go back? And I hated thinking that. I hated that 3 years of being told I was difficult, that I asked too much, that my work was a hobby and not a career. I hated that it left enough residue to make me doubt myself for even 30 seconds. "You're not dramatic." His voice was quiet and certain. "You're a woman who was slowly taught to see herself through someone else's very limited lens. The 30 seconds isn't weakness. It's just decontamination. It takes longer than 30 seconds. She looked at him. The amber eyes in daylight were richer, flecked with something deeper at the center. "You say these things," she said, "like you've studied people. I've ruled a pack for 11 years. You learn to read what people have been told about themselves versus what they actually are." He paused. "In your case, the distance between the two is substantial." Her chest did something complicated. She looked back at the forest. "The ring," he said, noting it on her finger, the moonstone one, not the one she'd left behind. "Not his. My grandmother's." She touched it. "The last thing she held. She gave it to me with those words. A woman who knows her own worth. I kept thinking, the night I found him, I kept thinking I'd lost my worth somewhere. Let it be taken. Worth isn't something that can be taken." He was looking at the ring, too. "It can be temporarily obscured, like bioluminescence in daylight. Still there, just harder to see." She didn't have a response to that would fit in words. She turned back to her sketchbook and began to draw the veil leaf, and he stayed beside her on the log until the light changed, and neither of them needed to fill the silence. Chapter 6. What Devlin Did Next. He came to the border station. She'd been using it as a regular workspace for 3 weeks. Brix had added a drawing table to the cottage with the casual indifference of someone who'd been told to make it comfortable and intended to comply fully. When Devlin Craith appeared at the tree line on a Tuesday afternoon with the wounded entitlement of a man who had never in his life had a door closed on him that he couldn't reopen, he was pack-born, middleweight wolf from the Craith family, with a small inheritance and a large opinion of his own magnetism. He was, objectively, handsome, in the way that some men are handsome because they've never been told otherwise. Marin. He looked at the cottage, at the drawing table visible through the window, at the borrowed boots she was still wearing because they fit better than her own. "What are you doing out here?" "Working." She kept her voice level, because Ossel had coached her for this, and Brix was inside and would hear if she needed anything. "For who? This is Viel territory. I have a permit." "You don't have a wolf." He said it the way he'd always said it, not as a cruelty, precisely, but as a reminder. A tiny needle of a reminder that she was, in his cosmology, missing something important. "Marin, you're being ridiculous. Come home." I made a mistake. It didn't mean anything, you know that. She felt the old pull, the familiar gravity of a relationship, even a broken one, even a wrong one. 3 years of mornings, and inside jokes, and the particular sadness of an almost right life. It meant something to me, she said. The trust meant something. You're being dramatic. Don't. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him. Don't say that to me again. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being accurate. He stepped closer, shifting to the persuasive mode she recognized, the lowered voice, the angle of approach that had always worked before. We can fix this. You just need to come back and... She said no. Calder stepped out from the tree line. He had not, from his position, been visible before, which meant he had either been standing very still behind an oak, or had been wolf form a moment ago, and either way the effect was the same. He was simply there, large and unhurried, with the particular stillness of someone who does not need to raise their voice to command a room. Devlin went rigid. Every wolf recognizes a superior, and Devlin Craith's body knew things his pride didn't want to admit. She's on my territory, Calder said. With my permit. On my time. A pause. You're not on my invitation list. Devlin's jaw worked. I was speaking to my... former, Marin said. The word fit in her mouth better than she expected. Devlin looked between her and Calder with a recalibrating expression. The specific recalibration of a man who has just understood the shape of a situation and deeply dislikes it. He settled on wounded dignity, which was the only currency he had left. I hope you know what you're doing, Marin. I'm beginning to, she said. He left. The forest was very quiet in his wake. Calder looked at her. She looked at Calder. You were in the trees, she said. I run the border. You've been running the border in this particular location with somewhat unusual frequency. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Her heart did the complicated thing again. She let it. Chapter 7. The Weight of Truth. It came out gradually, the way most true things do, not in a declaration, but in the accumulation of small moments that keep pointing in the same direction, until the direction becomes undeniable. He brought her dinner at the station 3 nights running, which Brix catalogued with the expression of someone compiling evidence. He remembered that she'd mentioned preferring tea to coffee, that the cold bothered her more than she let on, that she got a certain quality of quiet when she was thinking about something difficult. He asked about her work with an interest that was not performance. He looked at her finished illustrations with the patience of someone who understood that they were looking at something made, and that the making was the point. She asked about the pack, about governing, about the weight of it, about what it felt like to carry 11 years of other people's safety as a standing occupation. He told her, in pieces, about the loneliness of a leadership that makes everyone in your vicinity perform slightly different versions of themselves. About a mate who had died before his rule began, years ago, and left a silence in his life that had become so familiar he'd stopped noticing it as silence. Until recently, he said, and did not elaborate, and did not need to. On the 4th evening, with the first true winter snow beginning outside, and her drawings pinned across the cottage wall like windows into the forest's soul, he stood beside her looking at the veil leaf illustration and said, I want to keep seeing you. I want it to be a decision we've made, not something we're both quietly allowing. She had been waiting for this. She had been waiting for this the way you wait for something you can see coming from a long way off, and the waiting had not made you certain, just less surprised. I don't have a wolf, she said. I know what that means in pack politics. I know what your council will say. My council says what I allow my council to say. No arrogance in it, just the calm authority of a man who has earned his position 11 times over. And I'm telling you what I am willing to allow, which is them questioning whatever they like. What I'm asking is whether you want this. She looked at her grandmother's ring on her finger. The small moonstone, unremarkable in most light, iridescent when the light hit it right. Invisible worth, made visible by the right conditions. A woman who knows her own worth never truly goes hungry. She had let herself go hungry for 3 years. She had accepted small portions of respect and called them enough because she'd been told her appetite was unreasonable. She looked at Calder, who had never once suggested she ask for less. "Yes," she said. "I want this." He took her hand. His thumb moved over the moonstone ring without lifting it, without possessing, just acknowledging. Then he raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, with a formality that was also somehow entirely tender. And outside, the snow came down in thick, quiet curtains, and the Veilwood turned white. Chapter 8. Belonging. The Pack Council was, as predicted, a complicated audience. Not cruel. Calder had not built a court of cruelty, but uncertain, in the way that institutions are uncertain when presented with a thing that doesn't fit their categories. She had no wolf. She was not a traditional mate candidate. She was a botanical illustrator with a sketchbook and a twisted ankle origin story, and a moonstone ring that was older than anyone in the room. She stood in the great hall of Vile Keep, a vast stone space that smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and centuries, and she did not perform confidence she didn't have. She stood with the particular steadiness of someone who has been to the bottom of a ditch in the dark and climbed out and kept going. She answered questions with a direct honesty that was not combative, but also not deferential, because she had recently discovered that she didn't need to shrink herself to fit other people's comfort, and the discovery had turned out to be permanent. One elder, a silver-maned woman named Corith Vielle, looked at her for a long moment before asking, "What do you offer this pack?" "I offer what I am," Marin said, "which is a person of specific skill, genuine feeling, and hard-won clarity about my own worth. I can tell you exactly what I bring to this. I cannot tell you what you want to hear if it isn't true." Corith Vielle looked at her for another long moment. Then she looked at Calder, who had not moved from his seat at the head of the table, and who had listened to the entire proceeding with the patience of someone who already knew the ending. "She has your manner of speaking," Corith said, which was not a compliment or a criticism, but perhaps a recognition. "She has her own manner of speaking," Calder said. "I just learned to appreciate directness." It was not the council that mattered in the end. The pack sensed what packs always sense, the quality of the thing. Read not through ritual or politics, but through some older knowing. Marin walked through Vielle Keep that first week as Calder's acknowledged partner and found, against all odds, that people looked at her not with the evaluating gaze she'd braced for, but with something warmer. Recognition, perhaps. She was the woman from Dunmere who had walked into the Veilwood alone at midnight with nothing but stubbornness and ended up in a ditch. There is something a pack understands about that kind of courage, even without formal teeth to back it. Thessaly, the young guide, appointed herself Marin's unofficial Veilwood companion. Brix expressed her approval through the method of expanding the cottage drawing table to twice its size and saying nothing about it. The Veil leaf became Marin's particular study, and she spent the winter documenting its full seasonal cycle in a series of illustrations that she knew, quietly, would be the best work she'd ever done. Not because the forest was extraordinary, though it was, but because she was doing it from a place of fullness instead of hunger. Devlin Craith sent one final letter. She read it once, recognized it as the last attempt of someone who had not changed at all, and was angry that the world had changed around him, and composted it. Not ceremonially, just efficiently. Epilogue. 1 year later. The Vielle leaf came back in the second week of spring, the silver undersides catching the morning light as though the forest was quietly showing off. Marin sat on the same fallen log where she'd first drawn it, though someone, Calder almost certainly, had placed a flat stone beside it at some point in the intervening months that functioned as a very good side table for a thermos and a sketchbook. She'd stopped questioning these small acts of practical care. She'd started simply accepting them as the language of someone who had learned her needs by paying attention. He came through the trees just after 9, which was late for him. He'd been up before dawn with a boundary dispute between 2 younger pack families that had resolved itself mostly through breakfast, as these things often did when the mediator was both Alpha King and the kind of person who understood that people argue differently after they've eaten. She heard him shift at the tree line, the familiar sound like a sail filling, and then he was sitting beside her on the log, warm in the morning cold, leaning to look at what she was drawing. The published catalog had come out in the winter, 12 pages of Veilwood Botanicals, illustrated by M. Ashby, with a foreword by the Vail Pack Ecological Society that Corith Vail had written in a tone so grudgingly admiring that Marin had read it 4 times. The Vail leaf page had been pulled for a separate print that now hung framed in the great hall, which Marin found both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. She was drawing it again today because it was different in its second year. Subtly, the way all living things are different when you know them well enough to see the subtlety, and because she thought she understood now what made it worth documenting a second time. "The pack is asking," Calder said, looking at her drawing, "about a formal ceremony. Binding." "I know." Thessaly had informed her 3 days ago with barely contained excitement. "And?" She put down her pencil. She looked at the veil leaf illustration, and then at the moonstone ring on her finger, winter pale in the spring light, iridescent when she turned her hand. The last thing her grandmother's hands had touched. The thing she'd kept in the corridor when everything else was falling apart. A woman who knows her own worth never truly goes hungry. She had been hungry for so long, not for food, not even for love, but for the specific nourishment of being truly seen, of being known at her actual size. She thought about the 9-year-old girl who had received those words without a map to follow, and the 24-year-old woman who had run into a dark forest and found, improbably, the light she hadn't been looking for. She was not hungry anymore. She turned the moonstone ring off her finger, not discarding it, never that, and held it for a moment in her palm. The morning light caught it, and it bloomed blue-white, a small, impossible fire. She had her grandmother's eyes. She had her grandmother's stubbornness. She had, it turned out, her grandmother's understanding. That worth was not something bestowed, not something earned through being useful or diminished enough or easy to keep. It was structural. It was the thing underneath everything, and it had been there all along, waiting for the right light to make it visible. She closed her fingers around the ring. She looked at Calder, who was watching her with the amber, patient attention that she had come to understand as his most essential mode, present, full, expecting nothing and receiving everything. "The answer is yes," she said. "Tell the pack we'll set a date." He smiled. Not the ghost of one this time. The full, actual version, which transformed his face in a way that still surprised her, even now. How much warmth was stored in a person who had learned to lead with steadiness. She opened her hand. The moonstone caught the light again, blazing quietly. "My grandmother said a woman who knows her own worth never truly goes hungry." She looked at the ring, then at him. "I think she also meant that when you finally know it, really know it, you can stop running in the dark. You can just be somewhere." He took her free hand. She let him. The veil leaf above them caught the morning breeze and turned its silver undersides to the sky, and in the Veilwood, in the second week of spring, the light came through exactly right. End.